help catalyze those efforts. So, where can we direct funding? How can we break spending? As you have to assess installations to comprehend or in our government to do that forward thinking. And all the science and all the research tells us that if we don't do that forward thinking, we're going to be in a very bad situation. We're going to be spending trillions of dollars to mitigate it and remediate it and deal with the crisis, as opposed to spending the money on the front end, a lot less money on the front end, to deal with it in a smarter way. So we want to try to be proactive and change the way that we're thinking about this issue. And the MIRROR Act is one part of that effort.
I'm curious, is the conversation in the military community and the national security community the same around energy as it is around climate? I would imagine there has to be the same kind of preparedness and thinking around resources. How do you get your water, your power to a forward operating base, something like that? Is climate talked about in the same way, or does that end up becoming its own separate conversation?
Yeah, that's an insightful question. We still kind of treat them separately, although it's getting better. There's better integration between the issues, and there's still some politics involved there, right? I mean, different people from different political backgrounds tend to view this differently. I view it as the same discussion, that you can't talk about energy without talking about climate, because what we need to do to become energy independent, to actually untether ourselves from fossil fuels, to save the taxpayer money and become a 21st century military, and to address climate change, is the same thing that we need to do to reduce our reliance on carbon and fossil fuels. So for me, those have become integrated. For others, they're not. They still look at fossil fuels and traditional energy as the primary source, and the way that we will operate our military. It is getting better, though. And one of the things that we've done is I joined forces with Don Bacon, a Republican from Nebraska, and we actually created the Military Resiliency and Energy Caucus, which for you veterans out there actually is the MRE caucus. And the idea behind MRE is that we're going to bring together people from both sides of the aisle and have a comprehensive discussion of this issue. How does energy, how does our national security, our strategy, our tactics, and climate all come together as part of the same discussion? And how do we start talking about this in not as politically a charged way?
Well, let me ask you a political question, though. In this political climate that we're in, a lot of people who are worried about climate change want action quickly, and they say, we shouldn't wait for moderate solutions. So how do you both make sure that you're coming up with comprehensive and holistic solutions that appeal to everyone and ultimately get passed, but also make sure that you're pushing on progress in a way that meets the demands that the science says we need to meets the requirements of what science says we need to meet?
Yeah, well, wonderful question. I think not a lot of the things I'm talking about can be necessarily called moderate solutions. We like to label things, and those labels unfortunately mean different things to different people. So, I focus less on the label than I do on what needs to happen. What is the work that needs to happen? And I've had folks on the other side of the aisle come to me and say, hey, listen, I know this is a problem. I know that climate change is happening, and I know it's a threat to our troops and to our national security, and I'm willing to do the work. I'm willing to actually work with you and get things done. I just don't want you to talk about, throw the word climate change around all the time. So I think it is important that we have honest discussions about this, but at the same time, if someone's willing to come and do the work with me and do what needs to be done, I will be sensitive to that language, so that I can create a space for us to come together and actually do the work. Because at the end of the day, I'm more interested in just getting it done. I want to get the work done, and I want to get it done quickly and in a meaningful way, and not be wrapped up on the language necessarily. So that's part of it. But yeah, certainly building the coalition is hard. I mean, that's ultimately what politics is about. I represent a very diverse district, very diverse politically. I have just as many Republicans in my district as I do Democrats. So the question becomes, how do you create a coalition to get it done? And one of the things that everybody is still not great about is bringing in the working class Americans and bringing in labor and talking about the economic component of this. We have made this into a battle about, do we save the climate or do we save jobs and support middle-class families? And that's very unfortunate because it shouldn't be bifurcated like that, because we can and must do both. And actually, in my view, they're integrated to support the middle class and to promote economic development and great jobs. Actually, is the same thing as promoting the things we need to do to address climate change. They're one and the same, and we can and must do both.
There has been discussion of a green stimulus, and that could take on many different forms depending on who you speak to. But do you support that concept? And if so, what would it look like for you?
Yeah, I do, because of what I just described, because these are jobs. These are great jobs. There's a tremendous opportunity for America here to be a part of a brand new economy that could employ millions of Americans, that can help reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, that can reduce costs for the taxpayer, and actually do the right thing for the climate. We can do all of those things. It's a win-win-win-win situation. And it's not often in politics do you have a situation where everybody can win if you do it the right way. So the pandemic and the current economic crisis has hit the renewable energy and the green economy disproportionately hard. And that's why we have to make sure that we're promoting the production tax credit, the investment tax credit, and also infrastructure development to help promote economic development. I'll talk about Colorado. Colorado has had a huge and growing renewable energy economy. It's had double-digit growth for many years in a row. And we've lost a lot of those jobs. Up to 20% of those jobs have been lost just in the last few months. So we need to find ways to promote that job growth and that recovery. And the way I put it is, we have to decide where we want these jobs of the future to be. Either they're going to be in China or they're going to be in Europe, because those countries and continents know that this is the future economic growth opportunity, or it's going to be in Brighton, Colorado, and Aurora, Colorado, and other places. I'd rather those jobs be here, where we can build a middle class, and that's what I'm going to work on doing.
So some of the people listening today may be veterans who are looking to get into the advanced energy sector. If you're going to drill down a little further, do you have any recommendations for where the opportunities lie, maybe building off of your specific military-focused work or the broader clean energy system? I'm curious what your advice would be to them if they're looking to get into this space.
Yeah, there are great opportunities for veterans, and two that immediately come to mind. One is on the tactical element of this. We have forward operating bases and facilities all around the world, and there is great opportunity in research and development and innovation around how do we make those bases and facilities energy independent and secure. So tactical solar arrays, tactical electrical vehicles, other things that actually will save money in the long run, save U.S. taxpayer dollars, that are not noisy, that don't require a huge logistical footprint for refueling. But we know that one of our greatest vulnerabilities in Iraq and Afghanistan and other combat zones are the logistical supply chains in the convoys that we have to send to refuel our generators. We actually have taken casualties, many casualties, because of those refueling operations. So there's an opportunity in research and development on tactical energy that I think veterans are uniquely positioned to go into. Then the second is operations. One of the things that I learned in the Army is, how to conduct operations and how to operationalize something. How do you take an idea or a concept and you translate it into action? And people in the military are really good about that because talk is cheap in the military. You actually have to get the job done. So that training in the military on operations and how to operationalize ideas and concepts and put them into action is really critical, and there's great opportunities in the private sector and the public sector for people with that skill.
Speaking of other potential opportunities, I suppose this could lead to one. I believe you're involved with the GRID Act, and this works to address threats to the electric grid from nature, terrorism, or cyber attacks. It would do this by creating a 2-year pilot program between the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense to implement solutions for infrastructure vulnerabilities. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and the vulnerabilities you're talking about?
Yeah, Julia, the GRID Act was one of my amendments to the or actually one amendment we got into through the NDAA. It's a great program. What I talked about earlier in this idea of siloing actually is a great example for the GRID Act. So what the GRID Act basically does is it helps break down those silos between different government agencies, because the Department of Energy actually has the responsibility and the skills to conduct vulnerability assessments for our defense critical infrastructure and our critical defense facilities. But the DoD actually has to act on that and take those assessments and do something with it and fix them. So we have these two silos that don't overlap. The GRID Act breaks those down. It creates a pilot program where DOE and DoD will work together as one. DOE will do the assessments, and then the DoD will work on actually implementing remediation and mitigation to address the vulnerabilities. And then in addition to that, it actually expands the definition of these critical facilities that will be subject to this assessment to include Alaska, Hawaii, and the US territories, which of course have very important and very vulnerable defense facilities. So it expands the purview, breaks down the silo, and brings the two agencies or departments together to conduct a holistic assessment, but then actually convert that into action.
Interesting. Well, converting into action, I have a bit of a broader question. People listening may have heard of other sustainability initiatives, or just, I would call them national security initiatives that relate to energy. Things like the Great Green Fleet, which were, pitched several years ago as having operational benefits, switching to biofuels for the military, and yet that kind of faded. And, these issues we're talking about today aren't entirely new. There have been leaders in the military who've been, taking charge on this for some time. So what happens to those issues? Why do they kind of ebb and flow in the prior list of priorities? I would imagine politics has something to do with it, but is it just that we're hearing about those initiatives less, or is the military truly changing its focus as to how much these issues matter depending on the politics of the day? I'm just wondering how you would think about that.
Yeah, that's a great example. So I think a couple of things are happening here. First is, the Department of Defense has actually been ahead of everybody, or at least in the federal government, for a long time on this issue. And that's a result of operations. It's not for political reasons. It's because, directly impacts the operations. I referenced, the Navy's understanding of the temperature and the levels of the ocean, the flooding of our naval infrastructure now, the operating temperatures for our soldiers. I spend a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you acutely understand any change in temperature when you're walking the streets of Baghdad. And there's a big difference between 110 degrees and 113 degrees. You know that, and it impacts the way you do your business. So the military has understood that for a long time. But a couple of things that have happened since the time that the Green Fleet initiative kicked off and kind of faded. Number one is the research and development and the technology has vastly expanded. We have made leaps and bounds in our technology that's available for getting this stuff done. And a lot of that's happened on the private sector. So that's number one. There's a lot more capability and technology available now. The second, and maybe this is the most important, is how public perception has changed on this issue and how quickly it's changed. Just 10 years ago, only about 40% of Americans viewed climate change as a major problem. Now that number is well over 60%. In a matter of a decade. So it's gone from kind of being a third rail and an issue that not a majority of people really supported and understood or thought of as a priority to, well over a majority now view it as a major threat. And of course, public sentiment means a lot because it drives politics, and which of course then drives where we focus our efforts and where we focus our money and what we prioritize on Capitol Hill and throughout the government. So public perception has not even caught up with what was going on in the DoD, but it's actually surpassed, I think, what's happened within the federal government. And that's hugely important. So there's an opportunity now to not just go back and look at those initiatives, but how do we go forward and double down on what's being done and what more can we do?
What is the language that you use to talk about climate and energy issues? Again, the word choice is important here. And as you say, there's a lot of push coming from the public on this. And yet as we discussed, you're trying to foster collaboration. So are there certain ways you talk about this, in particular when you're speaking with other folks in maybe the military and national security community? What really makes this conversation land with that community?
Yeah, I tend to talk about it in the ways that I think have been underused. We don't tend to talk about the economic component of this. In the national security component of it, near enough, right? I mean, there's obviously the existential crisis that climate change poses for our planet and our ecosystems, and that I think is well documented. But what we don't do, and why some of these efforts have been stymied or slowed down, is on the economic side. And as I talked about just a few minutes ago, there has been this false narrative, this false choice that those who don't want this change and don't want progress to happen, that this false choice that people have presented, that it's saving the environment and climate, or it's putting food on the table of Americans, and they want to take your jobs away. That's just not true. It's just not true. It's the opposite. This is the economic development opportunity of our generation. This is a future economy where tens of millions of jobs can exist, good middle class jobs. So we have to change that narrative, and we have to say we can and should be doing all of it. We can save the climate. We can actually make our military more resilient and more sustainable. We can save money for the taxpayer and actually create tens of millions of great middle-class jobs in America if we do this the right way. And I think it's really important we talk about that. And then on the national security front, why veterans play such an important role in this discussion is because this really is a national security issue. And I would say maybe the greatest national security issue of our generation, because the impacts of climate change, are well documented. It's pandemics, which, by the way, people have been talking about for years, just not in the last 4 months. It's pandemics, it's mass migration, it's population displacement, it's a change of climate and water patterns, it's water conflicts. We have a major water conflict brewing in North Africa right now with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam between Ethiopia and Egypt that could very well spark into armed conflict. And there are many examples like that. So that's the way we need to talk about it and talk about those issues that have been under discussed.
I'm curious, do you support a 100% clean electricity standard in the US? Would you support that at a national level?
Absolutely, I do. I've signed on to a bill that says that we need to achieve 100% renewable energy, a clean energy standard by at least 2050, but that's way too slow in my estimation. Vice President Biden has come out and said 2035, and I support that if we can get there. The issue is the challenge is twofold. So it's not enough just to say, here's our goal, although you have to have the goal. You have to set the goal, because without a goal, a defined goal and timeline, then you just kind of spin your wheels. But the challenge is a couple of fold. Number one, we have to broaden our coalition on this, and we have to make sure that labor and working class Americans are included in this discussion, so they know that we're not trying to take people's jobs away. We're actually trying to increase the number of jobs available for people. Then the second thing we have to do is focus on infrastructure. And that's, as I say, the long pole in the tent. We can build windmills and solar arrays, but unless we have the transmission infrastructure and the grid and the storage capacity to move that from where the wind is blowing and the sun is shining to where it's not, then we can't truly have 100% renewable energy. And in Colorado, we're doing that, but it takes a long time to go through the siting and the permitting and the infrastructure construction to do that. I mean, that's a decade plus process. And that's why we have to talk about that first and start that process.
I'd like to end with a big macro picture question. So I'm curious, can you imagine a day when, say, the lines of military conflict are completely redrawn because the U.S. does not rely on fossil fuels? Geopolitics may change. The domestic energy infrastructure, say it reached 100%. Do you see that in your lifetime? Something truly radical where fossil fuels are out of the system, so much so that, again, it changes the face of national security maps.
I do see that, and I actually think that's the direction we're going. There are many challenges that we face, and there are many roadblocks in our way, but I'm actually encouraged by the progress. We're moving in the right direction. Young folks, people of my generation, our generation, are really leading the charge in many respects on this. They're demanding change, and there's a growing recognition that this is the right thing to do for everybody, for the economy, for national security, for sustainability. So I actually do think we're moving that way. And if you think about, if we aren't reliant on fossil fuels, I would posit to say that many of our conflicts and many of our involvements in the last 20 years either would not have happened or they wouldn't have happened to such a degree. We have now spent over $4 trillion by the most conservative estimations, thousands of lives lost on conflicts that just have not ended throughout the Middle East. We have still tens of thousands of troops there. We really have to have an honest discussion about where are our interests and why are we doing the things that we're doing. Certainly, if we are not relying on fossil fuels, it gives us a lot more freedom. It gives us a lot more flexibility. It's better for the economy, and I do think that we're going to get there. The question in my mind is whether we're going to get there soon enough, because it's just not a matter of getting there. We have finite time, right? I mean, the science and data show that we're pretty much out of time on this. So it has to happen quick, and there has to be a huge amount of urgency around it.
Great. Well, we will leave it there.